Welcome to the American Valor Podcast. Today, we are honored to welcome Anne Keene, acclaimed author of Cloudbuster 9, the untold story of Ted Williams and the baseball team that helped win World War II. A distinguished communication professional, Anne has served as documentary producer, congressional and presidential speechwriter, and journalist whose work has appeared in publications ranging from the New York Times all the way through history. And through her research and storytelling, she has helped preserve the remarkable legacy of athletes who answered the call to serve their nation during World War II. And welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Enrique. I'm a big fan of the work that you do and really honored to be on the podcast today.
Well, thank you for being with me and for those words. I greatly appreciate it. Before we get into the conversation around the four pillars and the Bob Feller Foundation, could you tell us a little bit about you that maybe the audience doesn't know, or what you up to these days?
Well, I'm originally from North Carolina, from a beautiful little small town near the mountains. Went to college in Chapel Hill, UNC in North Carolina. Lived in Washington, worked on the Hill. I was actually an appointee in the Bush administration, so I wrote about labor and employment in the agencies. But it was a great learning experience. And then years later, I landed here in Austin. I've been here 25 years. Had never really been to Austin before, but I love it. It's a great environment to be yourself, lots of writers, a lot of creativity, so many things to do, museums, book festivals. I just went to a signing for a friend last night. So very athletic. They have races every year, strong military presence. I'm really grateful to be here. It's been a great place to transition my career from just straight communications to actually realizing my dream of writing a book. I'm really still surprised that it's done so well. Frankly, it's not just a book stop, or a door stop. But anyway, it's great to join you today and to talk about one of my favorite subjects, major leaguers who served in World War II.
Absolutely. And folks, at the Bob Feller Active Valor Foundation, we strive to educate, support, and recognize by instilling the timeless values of service, sacrifice, legacy, and citizenship. And based on the pillars mentioned, I would like to start today's conversation with service. Ted Williams is often remembered as a baseball legend. No doubt about that. What did you discover about his commitment to serving something larger than himself?
Right. I love that question. I had the good fortune of meeting and working a little bit with his daughter, Claudia. She was the third born child. She was actually about my age. And sadly, she passed away a few years ago, wrote a book of her own about her relationship with her father. She was a tremendous person and knew him quite well. And even though she was in her 50s, 20 years younger than most children born to World War II veterans. She was very much had that stamp on her. And I enjoyed working with her. I learned a lot about her and her father. And she said, I will be glad to write the foreword for your book. But one thing I want to tell you is my father never did anything half-assed. So he was 100%, he was 1,000% in being a baseball player, in fishing, of course, serving as a Marine, as an instructor, and a combat pilot as John Glenn's wingman. He really was deeply committed to everything he did, and I think there's a tie there to serving something greater than self. Like that generation was very focused. They were loyal. They had their truth. They knew what their truth was, and then when we went to war, and we needed their help. They had no problem enlisting. I mean, and I've spoken to a lot of friends of Ted Williams, which I'll tell you about later, because obviously he had passed away. But I was so lucky to get to some of his dear friends long after he passed. And so I learned more about his character and the way he did serve a force, a power, a country greater than self.
And it's always nice to speak to those from different angles when you talk about any particular topic that you may ask about an individual. And so happy that you got the opportunity to speak to those individuals and his daughter. Wow, how close can you get, right? The
Yeah, she
daughter.
was great.
And now,
Mhm.
a lot of the things that we do in the military call for sacrifice. Ted Williams obviously made a huge sacrifice as he put one thing down to take it up for the nation. And Ted Williams famously lost years of his baseball career due to the
Right.
military service. So, how did he view that sacrifice?
I think again, he was all in and he had no regrets, really. I mean, of course, who's going to want to uh, enter the military when they're at the peak of their career? He's on the front, the cover of Life magazine, is really the emerging greatest hitter who ever lived. Um, he was a latchkey kid. He didn't grow up with a lot of money. But in terms of the sacrifice, he earned $75 a month serving in the military. He helped support his mother. That was a very common narrative based on the discussions I had. Now, I want to tell you, when I finished my book, and in my book, I interviewed people like Dr. Bobby Brown, third baseman for the Yankees. Um, he was a cardiologist who not only served in World War II, he served in the Korean War in a MASH unit. And I also interviewed Tommy Lasorda. And I say this because we talked a lot about Ted Williams. And when I interviewed my World War II guys, and at the time I started in 2018, 50 were alive, two are alive today. Bill Greason, he's 101. He's a Baptist minister, lives in Birmingham. He played in the Negro Leagues. He served at the Battle of Iwo Jima, saw the flag raising twice. I believe he was called back up in the Korean War, but he was actually the first African American pitcher for the St. Louis Cardinals. I think that was in 1954, but history made. And then another one, Bobby Shantz, who pitched for the Yankees, and he was a short guy, 5'6", too short to reach the pedals of a tank. So I believe he was sent over to an artillery unit, but still, those two are alive. And so when I got to Tommy Lasorda, it was 2 years before he passed away. And his assistant said, "We will be glad to meet you at the Starbucks in Fullerton." And when we opened that page, Williams, Tommy Lasorda just lit up and he actually started to tear up and cry. And I just sat there. He was a cool guy. And it was a moment I'll never forget. Frank Sinatra was playing over the radio, Fly Me to the Moon, and he was a friend of Tommy Lasorda's. I mean, when is that going to ever happen? So he sits there and he looks at me and he said, "Ted was such a good guy. They don't make guys like this anymore." And he surprised me with something. He said, "Do you realize when I was coaching the US men's Olympic team in Australia, Ted wanted to come with me. He wanted to help me. But at the time, he was in a hospital. He could barely walk. He was really sick. But then Lasorda became very emotional and he said, "That's sacrifice." He was willing to do that for me. And of course, we brought home the gold. But he remembered that. And to me, that's just an example of sacrifice, wanting to serve something greater than self that generation shared.
Yes, and they all did. It's amazing what effort, and you mentioned that earlier, right? It was there was an era where people were just 100% in what they did,
Oh, yeah.
and it really warms your heart that we had a nation at that level, at that capacity. I have my questions about how we are right now, but there are a lot that are still what we call holding the fort, right? Holding the fort
Mhm.
and being pillars. We speak about pillars in this medium, and there are still pillars of sacrifice that hold the nation up, and we're so grateful that you had the opportunity. I mean, how many people are sitting in a dining with Tommy Lasorda?
I know.
Speaking about other legends, it's what a wonderful experience. Now, it leads me to the question around legacy.
Mhm.
What do you think the story of Cloudbuster 9 remained largely untold for so many years?
Well, I love that question. I'm thinking about this. I think there are two big reasons. The first is There have been stories written about Navy pre-flight, which is where my book was based. It was during World War II when the Navy opened 5 pre-flight schools where they focused on ground training, emotional training, to make sure these guys could get behind the controls of fighters. And so my book is based in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. My dad was the VAP boy. When he passed away, I dug into the archives to try to reconstruct this history. How did he get there? And why is his picture on the wall of my parents' living room with Ted Williams and Johnny Pesky? I mean, I knew a little bit about it, but I was hungry to learn more. And so when I went to Chapel Hill, I found some term papers, which were excellent. But they were written in the 70s and the early 80s. And they were very well written, but they lacked a lot of the information that we can get today. So, in other words, I think these students were using 25% of the information that we have available today because of the internet, because of digitized records. And, they were reading newspapers, very tactile. They were looking at photographs. They were using hard material to document the history of the Navy pre-flight school in Chapel Hill. Whereas I was able to dive in, we found thousands of articles there at Wilson Library, and they were wonderfully helpful. We found hundreds and hundreds of like Life magazine quality pictures that I was able to use to construct the book. And then when I came to Ted Williams, I found a few clues, but my magic bullet was a woman named Lori Miller who owns a company called Redbird Research. And I want the military veterans and families of veterans out there to know about her. You can just look up Redbird Research. But what she does, she has a company, she goes into the archives and she pulls the service jackets. And I think for the first time, she pulled Ted Williams, and I got 200 pages. I mean, it was a box this high on my front porch. And I started sifting through them. I actually shared them with his daughter, Claudia, who had never seen anything like that before. And she became quite emotional. And I actually donated it to the Hall of Fame up in Cooperstown, just shared these valuable records so other people can read the story. But, that was one reason. Another reason was, and why this story remained untold, is because during the war, they were fiercely protected of celebrity athletes' privacy. And in Chapel Hill, the Navy didn't mess around. They had guarded sentry posts. You had to have a pass to get on base. It was called Hell's Half Acre. And they trained from 5 a.m. until midnight, practically, just physical exercises. It was dangerous work. Cadets died. It was really one of the most aggressive training programs ever imagined for the United States. But they had to do this. As you know, as a military veteran, it was all or nothing. So what they did was they kept out the reporters who were looking to stir up stories, the paparazzi. There was no paparazzi back then, but they did not stand a chance of getting on that base. And so when people like Ted Williams came in, and just imagine this, LeBron James, I mean, how do you hide somebody like that? But he came in, Ted Williams comes in, they put him in a college dorm with all the other cadets, Johnny Pesky. They play on the baseball team there. And as a side note, they were, mainly major league players on the Navy team training in Chapel Hill. But, he's training and he thrived on being an average Joe. But again, his privacy was protected. The military was very careful about press releases. The picture on the wall of my dad with Ted Williams and Johnny Pesky was a Navy recruiting picture. So it all made sense. And so when I dove into those archives, I was able to piece the military newspapers together, find the timeline, find out who was there. And since my book has come out, I hear from people all the time, relatives, children, grandchildren, and they'll be like, that is my dad on the cover of your book. I had no idea that he was there. And I'm able to point them to resources where they can really get the records, and they can get them pretty quickly. She'll turn it around in about a week or two, but it's just completing a family portrait. It's completing an important part of our history as a country, because as we know, baseball and military service are intertwined, always have been. And, again, it's telling that story in full. And so anyway, I get reach outs from people. It's a lot of fun to do that, to share that story. And the last thing I'm going to say is at one point, um, celebrity players like Williams, they started to get a little too much attention. And so another reason his story wasn't untold was when they started getting some bad headlines, they just kept him on base. He didn't get to travel with the team. So when the Cloudbusters set up to play the Yankees, the Yanklands, a team managed by Babe Ruth, they were a team blended together from Yankees and Indians. He was told he wasn't going to go. So the headline said, Ted Williams to stay home. So, that was just another reason he eventually did get to go. But again, there was just a lot of controlled public relations during the war.
Yes, and some you have to understand, right? At the time, between the privacy and things that were going on, you didn't want some information to be out there for all to read. But so glad that he was involved in that capacity. And as citizens, we get the opportunity, right, to sign up and say, "Hey, I'll go if needed." That call doesn't happen for everybody, neither should it, right? Because there are some limitations on, who can serve. But such a wonderful story around those that had this career that's rising and they're doing so well, and the world has this call and all hands on deck, right? We have
Right.
to
Oh,
get
yeah.
as many as possible, and these people put this lucrative and successful career down to be citizens, right? And talking
Right.
about citizenship, what does the story of Cloudbuster 9 teach us about being engaged and responsible citizens?
Well, I think if you look at some of the main characters in the book, and this just blew my mind, it was such a great find. When I found the materials, a Trojan horse opened with names of historic figures. It was George uh, Bush, Gerald Ford, Scott Carpenter. John Glenn was at Navy pre-flight up in Iowa. Carpenter, I believe, was out in California. William Clay Ford. Bear Bryant was not only the football coach, he was the baseball coach. And they're Hall of Famers like Charlie Gehringer. Jack Dempsey came through. Gene Tunney was there. John Wooden was another. And, Wooden has written many books. And, one of the messages in terms of character and legacy is, he encouraged people to focus on what they were doing, not on how that came across. It was about the good duty, not the image. And so I think, you look at some of the cast of characters and the cadets who served in Navy pre-flight, which was actually a very, very small program. Just the names themselves, they became presidents, astronauts, corporate leaders, like again, William Clay Ford, scientists, and of course, famous athletes and Hall of Famers like Ted Williams. That's what it produced. And one other note I'll make is John Glenn, soon out of the program, became a Navy recruiter. And he was in his early 20s, and he was shadowed by Esquire magazine when he was at a recruiting station. And they said, what do you look for? And the term right stuff was actually used because he was looking for humble guys who would do the job, they would finish the job. They were supportive, they were loyal, and they were humble. That was really important. But again, that was part of the right stuff culture for this generation.
And humility is such a great character. And as talking about character, Ted Williams could have focused solely on becoming one of the greatest baseball players in history, yet he chose to serve. And in
Mhm.
today's culture where personal success is often celebrated above all else, what does his decision teach us about character?
Well, I think, I've got a young daughter in her early 20s, and she got out of college last year. And I think the world is a tough place. I think with social media, it's who are we? What is our truth? And I think that particular generation, they knew what their truth was. They were focused. And when I met with Tommy Lasorda, he looked at me and he said, "Look at these people in the coffee shop, these kids, they're completely entrenched in their laptops and their cell phones." And he just said, "There's not a sense of awareness." And when I grew up, you know, I remember where I was when Pearl Harbor was bombed. And he said, we had a sense of focus that kept us anchored. And his message to the next generation, what I think he would want to pass on, as well as Ted Williams, is know who you are, know what your values are, know what you stand for, be loyal to your country, be loyal to yourself, and be loyal to your family and your friends and your leaders. I mean, some of the other World War II guys said, it makes me sad. There's just the level of respect is just so distorted here. We need to not only respect our leaders, our first responders, our military, members of the military. We really need to show great respect, but we also need to have respect for self. And so, that's um, another trait, if you will, another value that they enforced. A couple of other things. The old timers, the old leaguers, as I call them, who I interviewed, they were all in their 90s. Some were over age 100. They all worked until the end of their life. I thought that was really interesting. One of the major leaguers sold men's clothes well into his 80s, just to do it. He didn't have to do it. But they did a lot of good volunteer work. I can tell you this, Tommy Lasorda had his Escalade ready to do a pop-up Dodger event at any time. There were flags and cups, and I rode in the back of the car actually to meet his wife. He told me more about the story of World War II, but he was ready to go. And he said to me, I think America is the greatest country in the world. People need to know that. They need to know, what we fought for. And they also need to feel very fortunate. He wished that upon kids today. But again, I think there was a sense of loyalty, a sense of focus, a sense of just a really strong moral compass. um, they also had a sense of faith, and that is something I learned more about from Dr. Greason, the Baptist minister, again, age 101, who lives down in Birmingham, Alabama. I had a chance to talk to him a few years ago, and he basically said, doesn't really matter what your religion is. It's a matter of just stepping outside yourself, and it's about hope, and it's about a belief. And it's commonly known that when he was on the beach, the Battle of Iwo Jima, he just made a pledge. If he survived that, he was going to serve the Lord, but he was also going to go back into baseball and do wonderful things with his life. And that's what he's done, and that's what a lot of his peers in World War II and the Korean War, they did. One of the last gentlemen I interviewed was a guy named Frank Saucier. He was a Texan. He lived in Amarillo, and he passed away in his mid 90s, but he was one of the last St. Louis Browns, and he served in the Navy twice in the World War II and the Korean War. And he said to me, I'm almost 100 years old. I've seen booms and busts and pandemics and wars and recessions and depressions. And he ended up becoming a wildcatter in the oil business in Texas. He left the major leagues to do so. But he just kind of leaned back and he said, I grew in the military. I became a man in the military. And his sense was everything is going to be all right. I got that message from every one of these guys. And this is probably the most important point I'm going to make in the conversation is when I asked them, how do you feel about sacrifice? How did you feel about pausing your baseball career to serve in the military? They all basically said, let's look at it this way. Whether they served stateside, in active combat, they all said in their own way, especially Frank Saucier, who said, I am more proud of my military service than any contribution I ever made to baseball. Even World Series, you know, people who, won multiple World Series, it's they still felt their humble service in the military was one of the most defining, important contributions they ever made.
Very profound statement, and one
Yeah.
that I agree with. There are a lot of things that we can attain and reach milestones, goals, and things like that. There's just something different about answering the nation's call to
Mhm.
serve and protect our citizens. And if you look at it at the grand scheme of what that would be, you are the wall between the enemy and our
Hmm.
citizenship.
Right.
And so, yeah, I kind of agree and glad he said so. And thank you for those interviews and capturing those stories and encapsulating this in what is now a bestseller. So, congratulations
Well, I
on
did not
that.
expect that. Again, I was just grateful it wasn't a doorstop. I had no idea, but I believe it's not really my writing. I think there's a real hunger for heroes. And I did give a lot of speeches around the country when the book first came out. I'm still talking every now and then. But one thing I experienced over and over was that at the end of my remarks, people would come up and I would sign the book. And a lot of members of the military, especially Marines, would approach me. And one night, a Marine, I would say in his 70s, came and he was sobbing. He was wearing a Red Sox hat, tears literally dripping from his chin. And it felt a little awkward, but I said, thank you for coming. And he said, I want to tell you something. I'm sad because I feel like America's losing its heroes. Now, we're not losing our heroes. I think they're heroes everywhere. They're school teachers, they're coaches, they're military leaders, you name it. But he was in tears and he said, Ted Williams was a true leader. John Glenn was a leader, and they yearn for that. And that it was such a pleasure to write the book. And if I do anything, if I send that message out to go find your heroes, it was worth it. But again, it's quite emotional. I still get emails and letters from people today who are connected in some way to this story. So I think that's why it continues to sell. And I think we're down to literally the last several thousand. I'm not sure what the exact number is, but in terms of World War II survivors, maybe 1%ish. I don't know. I have to check with the World War II Museum. But I mean, they are dwindling. So I would encourage everyone now, if you know someone who served in World War II, to approach them, to ask them, how they feel. What was the most important contribution of their lives? How did you feel about serving in the war? Reflecting, how do you view today? Do you think we're at risk? I mean, what would you encourage kids to do to move forward? So use these opportunities before these people are gone. I had a great opportunity to talk to, I don't know, maybe 15, 20 World War II veterans to write my book. They have all passed away, which makes me sad. But just the intelligence that they offered, it's right there. It's operating instructions for life about being humble and loyal and focused and true.
Wonderful. And for those that get an opportunity to purchase and read your book, what do you hope readers remember most from your book?
Wow. I think one thing that made my book unusual was it wasn't just a straight World War II book. It hinged on my father as a child. He had been a professional ball player. He was an All-American pitcher at Carolina, pitched for the Durham Bulls, made it into the system, so to speak, had high hopes, but he got hurt. And when that happens to someone, and it happens to all of us, we all get hurt. I never knew why he quit baseball. I heard bits and pieces, but until I saw it in writing, I really mourned for him. I had a lot more compassion for him. But again, I think we all get hurt, we all get disappointed. But it was just something for me. It was great to imprint that legacy of his involvement during the war. As a kid, he had no clue that he was doing recruiting ads. He was just smiling and he was a bat boy and, he was 10 years old. But again, I think that it was the human experience is where this opened up. And I was able to take that and put it into the context of a narrative nonfiction, uh, true to life story. And so, again, I'm really proud of that. But that's where I'm leading other people. They are discovering their parents and the legacy of their grandparents. And these were just the greatest guys ever. I mean, again, you look, George Bush was there, Gerald Ford, John Glenn, um, I mean, they really did serve their country. But, again, their children have come back to carry on their legacy. Claudia Williams did it. She was a nurse. You look at Bill Ford, the son of William Clay Ford. He was a Navy pre-flight cadet out in California. I mean, they are serving a greater purpose. And, it's still there. And I just think that we just need to celebrate that legacy.
And I agree. So thank you for writing that. Thank you for bringing that to the public for them to be able to experience it as well. Now, you do have things that you do now. Where can our audience learn more about you and how to support your current efforts?
Well, I am actually working on another book. I'm not going to really get into the subject yet, but that will eventually be coming out. I'm trying to work on some screenplays and learn how to do that. But I think really to support my book, just read my book, Cloudbuster 9. You can get it anywhere, Amazon, Walmart, Target, Apple. It's the publisher's done a very nice job of getting it out there to the world. Um, and you can certainly reach out to me. My website is ANNERKEENE.com. So it's AnneKeene.com. Reach out to me anytime. I'm glad to sign book plates and mail them to people. So, I also think, reading my book, sharing my story, and passing my story along to people who might have a connection. And it brings families together. I've worked with a number of families who were the children and the grandchildren of Marines, brought them closer together. Um, so I'll be touring a little bit, hopefully, with the second book. But for right now, I'm in Austin, just slaving away. And let me tell you, that second book is a lot harder to write than the first one. I'm not supposed to say that, but it's hard because you have expectations. I never expected this to sell like it has. And I don't know that I can ever beat this, but I think know what makes a good book. And a lot of it comes from our hearts.
Absolutely. Now, folks, we'll have links in the show notes for you to be able to support Anne and her efforts and purchase her book. But thank you so much for being with us. And for more information on the foundation, please visit us at our website, activevaloraward.org. And on behalf of the Bob Feller Active Valor Foundation, thank you all for joining us on this episode.